Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's presentation, Why Reserve Funding and Preventive Maintenance Can't Wait. My name is McKinley Thompson. I'm one of the marketing managers here at Dude Solutions, and I'll also be the moderator for today's presentation. Just to cover a few things before we get started, our phone lines have been muted, but we definitely don't want that to discourage any participation, so please do submit the questions as you have them. You should see a chat bubble in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, and that'll be how you can answer any questions that we'll get to at the Q&A portion at the conclusion of today's event. If we aren't able to get to any questions, we'll follow up with you afterward. But just so you know, we are recording this presentation, and we will send a copy of the slides and the recording for you to refer back to in the future. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Donovan Loomis. He's our worship facility specialist here at Dude Solutions, and he's going to kick us off here. Donovan?
Thanks, McKinley, and good afternoon, everyone. Glad you guys could join us here. Like McKinley mentioned, I'm the worship facilities specialist here. I work with all of our churches and religious organizations, as well as most of our nonprofit organizations here when it comes to asset management and capital planning. And I've had the great pleasure of knowing Frank for a few years now. Frank has been using our solutions at his previous place of work, as well as where he is now, and I've been very impressed over the last few years in speaking with Frank on his intelligence when it comes to different areas of challenges that folks face in the facility management world. So Frank, I know you have a long list of titles here, so why don't I let you tell us a little bit about your background and where you come from and what it is that you do now.
Yeah, thanks, Donovan, and good afternoon, everyone. So I've had the great pleasure for the last decade or so to participate in capital work at a variety of churches. I'm trained as an accountant, as boring and dry as that is, but I've been very fortunate that I did a lot of my studying and focused a lot on capital asset management in my schooling, and continue to commit a lot of time to that now. My great pleasure and pride is historic buildings and their care and maintenance. And I also do a lot of work with buildings that might not be so historic but are in need of significant capital work. That's definitely a big pleasure of mine, is dealing with buildings in distress. So right now I'm working for a not-for-profit cooperative townhouse complex in Vaughan, Ontario. We're currently undergoing a $2.2 million restoration of the building envelope, and I continue to work with many churches and other not-for-profits and charities, overseeing various capital work as well as operational challenges.
Thanks, Frank. I appreciate that. Why don't we talk quickly about the agenda before we dive into your stories and some things you'd like to share. The first thing we'll do is talk a little bit about dangerous thought patterns associated with reserve funding and deferred maintenance, and then we'll talk a little bit about lack of funds and what happens when the funds don't seem to be available for saving for these large capital replacements, and then talk a little bit about what to do to prepare financially for those eventual replacements and having that reserve fund established. And then lastly, we'll follow up with touching briefly on the preventive maintenance side, and that might be something that doesn't necessarily seem to be tied directly into reserve funding, but it certainly does affect the longevity of your facilities and your assets, and does have an effect on those replacements as well. So we'll talk a little bit about how that ties into this all. So Frank, in thinking about the dangerous thought patterns, I work with a lot of churches, and I see a lot of different thinking that kind of leads to having a inadequate fund, I guess you could say. But
Yep.
from your experience, would you share with us a little bit about some dangerous thought patterns that you've observed?
Yeah, so I think the most dangerous thing I hear all the time is, if it's not broke, don't fix it. Don't worry about it. It'll be okay. That kind of thinking is where you're going to hit problems. If you aren't planning in advance for the realistic need of your facility, you're going to face problems when something happens. In line with thinking about, okay, we're going to have to replace these things, we're going to have to do significant repairs of these things, is being objective about what those things actually cost. I often hear from people that, that's not expensive, oh, we can afford that. And then when the day comes that it actually breaks and they go get a quote, they're really shocked to find out that the thing they thought was going to cost $5,000 is actually probably going to cost about $35,000. I'll give you a very good example. The place where I'm at currently, the townhouse complex I'm at now, for the last 35 years, they've operated on the philosophy that what's left at the end of the year is what we will set aside for our reserve fund. Planned contributions were very low. And sure enough, when the day came that, okay, we need to start working on things, the engineering report came in and said, okay, you have about $8 million worth of work to do. And we looked at the reserve fund and realized we only had about $3.5 million of work to do, of money to do work with. But of course, for the last 35 years, everyone had been under the idea, under the guise, that $3 million is a lot of money. That's plenty of money. We could rebuild the whole building for $3 million if we wanted to, but the reality is a roof alone is going to cost you $750,000. Some new windows, there's another $900,000, and the list goes on from there. So realistic planning and thoughtful planning is very important to good, strong stewardship of your buildings. If you're not being realistic, you're going to have problems. But on the other hand, that also contributes to the ongoing life of your worship organization or your not-for-profit or your charity, is planning out what you actually need. I had the fortune a few years ago of attending with a church who was finally planning to do some capital work, and they were very excited about all this. And I looked at their reserve fund and I thought to myself, wow, you guys have set aside a lot of money. And they said, yeah, we've been working really hard to set aside that amount of money. And I said, why have you set aside that much? And he said, well, we weren't sure how much to set aside. So we thought if we put aside more, it'd be better. As it turned out, for the last 5 years, the church had been shutting down programming, firing staff, and reducing the size of their organization to put unnecessary amounts of money away because they thought they were going to need to buy a new roof every 10 years because they didn't think it through. And so in the end, they ended up being bad stewards of their resources, hurting their congregation. And sure, we still had the money to reinvest back into the congregation, but we had 10 years of damage that had to be restored. A lot of faith had been lost in that community because people were under the impression that we can't afford the building, when really they were doing very well. But they didn't see it that way because they weren't planning objectively. They were planning recklessly. And I see a lot of organizations that plan recklessly, mostly on the other end of the spectrum where they don't save enough. But either way you fold it, you have to be realistic of what the cost of things is, how inflation impacts that, and when things are realistically going to fail.
Yeah, that's interesting, Frank, because it is rare that you hear a story like that falls on that side of the spectrum. Do you have ideas in mind for folks who maybe don't know what the life expectancy of a roof is, and even maybe more commonly their air handling units and some of those other assets that they have. If they really don't have that information, how would you recommend them getting that?
I mean, there's 100 ways to look at those sorts of things, and there's a lot of different schools of thought. And there is no golden rule. There's no way to say for certain this material of roof is going to last exactly 30 years, and on 30 years and one day it's just going to fall off. So thinking things through. Look into having a building condition assessment done, having an engineer look at your building and advise you on what the realistic life expectancy of your equipment is. When you're purchasing new equipment, talk to your sales rep, talk to your engineering team. Ask them how long the expected life expectancy is of the equipment realistically. Read the owner's manual. You'll often find in there that they have maintenance plans for your equipment, or they'll provide recommended maintenance schedules, and those recommended maintenance schedules will usually have in them an indicator of at what point the machine is no longer considered reliable. And at all times, take advantage of the experts around you. Your HVAC technician knows your equipment. Ask him or her what their thoughts are. Your maintenance guy has been around the block a few times and may have some insight into what the overall condition of your roof is or your foundation walls if they're starting to crack and show age. Take advantage of your human resources and ask them what their realistic opinion is of the ongoing status of your facility.
That's good. Yeah. Thanks for that, Frank. I'm going to move us to the next point here in talking about the lack of funds, because this is something, obviously in any industry this is common, I'm sure, but in the church world, as we're talking through this here, sometimes reserve funding is placed on the back burner because we have this mission, right, to spread the gospel and to reach those in our community and globally, and putting money aside for something that doesn't seem to be a pressing need for right now almost seems foolish. So when that thought pattern comes into play and you get 5-10 years down the road, and then things start to need to be replaced, and you realize that there is a lack of funds there to make those needed replacements. Can you talk a little bit about what your experience has been with that, how to play that game of catch-up to get to where you need to be?
Yeah. Catch-up is the hardest game in building management. Simply, it is the most difficult thing you're going to ever have to do when it comes to proper upkeep of a building. If you have let that savings account dwindle down and you haven't planned for those necessities, you're going to face challenges. So I think what everybody needs to be doing is getting ahead of the curve now and looking at planning, reserve fund planning now, and building condition assessment planning now to get ahead of that curveball. Because the reality is things are generally more expensive than you expect them to be. And not only that, even if you have a good solid quote, you're always going to have situations where there's discovery work involved, where there's new challenges involved when installation is happening or when work is happening. And that lack of objectivity is very hard to get over. So when you make that decision that planning out your building's life is going to be a priority for you, the first thing you need to do is to get realistic, objective facts and figures about how much money you're going to need and when you're going to need it. I had a church a few years ago. They called me, our boiler's broken down. It's the middle of an ice storm. We don't have a boiler anymore, but it's okay. We have $20,000 set aside to replace the boiler. I thought, okay. Went down there, got a company in. Sure enough, company says you're looking at $45,000 to replace that boiler. Got a few more companies in, and prices went as high as $60,000. So then we realized that we were going to have a problem. we were going to have a $25,000 problem. And that is a lack of advanced planning. And that is going to be the problem. So now, of course, we had to spend the $20,000 to fix the equipment, to get it limping back along again. And it's been limping now for 2 years. And we don't have that $45,000 waiting when it does finally break.
Yeah. Yeah, and I see that sometimes too, where folks, maybe a church relies on someone who gives a lot, someone within the congregation that I guess probably the best way to put it would be they tend to bail them out when they get into these types of situations, and over time they can exhaust that person. Have you found similar experiences there in the past as well?
Yes. Churches are renowned for having that one guy who's going to be committed to the end. In my experience, his name is always Don. I don't know why, but all of mine have always been named Don, so I call them Don. And they are wonderful people, and they are good people and people who we should value and respect. But the reality is when we abuse those people, we end up short-sighting ourselves. One of the common errors that I've seen is organizations that will get a BCA done, will take those positive first steps towards planning out their capital, and then they will decide that, oh, that won't cost as much because Don can do it, and that won't cost as much because Don can do half of it. And people will start planning around this idea of this person. And then when the time comes, that person isn't available. Their kids are visiting from out of town this week and they're busy. And now you have a problem where you've planned around something that wasn't realistic. So when you have people, you want to engage them. You want them to feel useful. You want them to feel like they're part of your organization. And that is good and that is healthy. But you also don't want to abuse them, and you also don't want to become complacent that they're always going to be there.
Yeah, that's a good point. Frank, a lot of my friends call me Don for short, but I don't know that I'm that guy for our church. So maybe I will be someday. I don't know.
You never know.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about budgeting techniques and some ways we can shift the mindset to kind of change not just our own, but even leadership's thinking around this reserve funding. And I know you've been pretty creative in the past with some folks that you've worked with. Would you mind sharing a little bit about what you've done for folks to kind of help shift that mindset?
Yeah. So I think the most critical thing, the first decision that you have to make as an organization is that your building is like any utility, like any bill, like any staff member's salary. This is important. This is a priority, and this is something that we have to remain committed to. I always tell every church that I've ever worked with that your replacement reserve fund contributions have to be treated like any bill. You wouldn't let your water bill lapse for 3 or 4 months. You wouldn't let your gas bill lapse for 3 or 4 months. You wouldn't let your electricity bill go unpaid for a couple weeks. Those things are important and you have to be on top of them. Your building has to be treated the same way. So when you're making that reserve fund plan, be realistic about how much money you need to set aside to make the repairs every year, every quarter, whatever your organization needs, and make sure that whatever you're putting away, keep it equal, keep it simple, keep it stable. And what most people are shocked to find out is that in the grand scheme of things, if you plan it out over 5, 10, 15, 20 years, the actual month-over-month cost of taking care of your facilities doesn't end up costing you as much as you would expect. I had one organization that I had worked with for several years planning out their replacement reserve fund, and they were very pleased with themselves. And they started making contributions, they started making purchases, and they started reinvesting in their worship space and in their facility, which was very exciting for them as a community. But as time went on, they started to lapse. And maybe this month we don't have to put aside the whole amount. We can borrow a little bit this week, and we'll put it back next month. And again, you get into those dangerous thought patterns that this isn't an everyday thing, it's only a special occasion thing. So we can deviate from the plan when it's convenient. Now, that particular organization faced some very serious difficulties. Over time, they would borrow a little bit and put back a little bit less in their reserve fund. And they did this enough times that when the day came that they needed the money, it wasn't there. So what's really critical is that as an ongoing initiative to not let this lapse. That church ended up coming back to me a few years after I had stopped working with them and said, we don't know where we went wrong. We don't know how this happened, that we didn't have the money when we needed it. And I said, well, I can tell you what happened. You spent it poorly. And he said, well, how do we move past this? So what we actually ended up doing, as ridiculous as it's going to sound, is still to this day, on the first of the month, every month, I mail them an invoice. And the invoice is marked payable to their savings account. And as silly as it sounds, it's a little reminder to their treasurer, to their leadership, to get that bill every month that says, you need to put $1,800 into this account, or there's going to be problems like any bill that goes unpaid. So for the last year and a half now, I've been regularly mailing them a bill just to remind themselves. And that's the important thing. Our buildings are around us all the time. We're using them all the time. We're interacting with them all the time. And realistically, we're wearing them out all the time. And if people aren't prepared to acknowledge that this is an all-the-time thing, then when the time comes to have to fix something, you're going to have a problem.
Yeah.
Check your reserve fund plan often. Every year, look back. What was inflation this year? Was it higher than we had budgeted for? Was it lower than we had budgeted for? Are we getting behind in contribution? Okay, we budgeted on 2% inflation, and inflation was actually 3%. We need to put an extra percentage into that account. Can we afford to do it in one lump sum today, or do we need to add that extra percentage point on to the next 12 months payment to keep that fund adequately funded? When was the last time we got a current quote on the replacement cost of the main boiler? Should we get that quote updated? Is there new technology available that might be more expensive to install, but we would want to invest in? Do we want to start planning for that now? Or have the cost of things shifted? Have they gone down with new technology? That's often a case that people are pleasantly surprised by. Check that reserve fund regularly. At minimum, you need to be familiar with that account every year. And if otherwise, you're going to start having problems. I encourage people to, every time you make a purchase using that reserve fund, that is a good opportunity to stop and review the document. Just to get an idea. You don't need to revise it every time. But if you just made a big purchase out of your reserve fund, that's a good opportunity to stop and look at it and say, okay, we budgeted 30, but we spent 32. Does that mean that everything else is going to be 4% higher? Or was that just, or can we find a reason why that extra 4% happened? And if we can't find a reason why that 4% happened, then we need to assume that that is what's going on in our neighborhood, in our region, in our state, in our province, and that's going to be the going concern moving forward. And act on that Don't just discuss it at a meeting and then say, okay, that's a thing. You need to act on it, and you need to decide, again, going back to that idea that your building has to be important to you, and this needs to be an everyday thing.
Yeah, it really comes down to a mindset, right, and priorities. And it's a lot, as you're talking about this, it reminds me of just our personal budgeting as well, right? If you don't think a lot about your personal savings account and you're not intentional about it, then your funds are always going to go elsewhere, right? There's always going to be other demands and other things popping up that are going to seem like they take precedence. But when you start to plan ahead and write things out and have the information there to tell you this is what's going to happen, then it does take precedence and it does become a priority. But there really does. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I think what's really important there that I should have alluded to better is that idea of a savings account. A big mistake that I see a lot of churches especially make is designating funds within their operating bank account as the reserve fund, quote unquote. Take the extra effort, go open a second bank account, physically move that money somewhere else. Physically get it out of sight, out of mind. Don't let temptation be sitting in front of you. Move that money. It's a good practice to physically make that movement from one account to the other so that you can mentally be aware that this money is the money we don't touch. This money is the money that's planned for.
Consider it as already spent, right?
Exactly. It is basically already spent because you have the building. Unless you're planning on selling the building, you're going to be spending that money. So consider it's gone and let that be what it is so that you don't dip into that account. Make it difficult to spend that money. Make it so that you need to cut a check from that account and two people have to sign it and we really have to, I don't know, guys, is this the smartest thing to do? Or can we wait a couple months until we sorted this out to make that new purchase? I don't know. Make it inconvenient.
That's a good point. Frank, I would like to talk a little bit about the preventive maintenance side of things as well before we wrap up here. So, thinking about the reserve funding side and obviously preparing for those replacements, there's some things we can do to push those or to extend the life of our assets so that we can put those off as long as possible. But obviously, preventive maintenance is a huge part of that, and it has a huge impact on how long your assets will last. But how does one, properly plan and budget for keeping up with the preventive maintenance when it seems like just putting out the day-to-day fires that come up is all we have time for and all we have the resources for?
Again, we're going back to those same dangerous thought patterns, that we need to focus on one problem, that we can't make time for two problems. And that is, again, going back to the original idea where we started this whole conversation around, those are some very dangerous thought patterns. The reality of the matter is that if we don't get ahead of things, we're going to have problems. And the thing that I see most often is the more we invest in preventative maintenance, the more we realize that those fires become fewer and fewer and fewer. And so, again, it's that idea of putting it forward, investing in the next stage of your building, investing in the future of your organization. The more we put into preventative maintenance, the more you're going to see that payoff in fewer fires to put out. So the important thing is to start off by inventorying your equipment, being aware of what's in your building, what needs to be taken care of. As I said before, take advantage of your experts. Talk to the dons in your church who have been there for 100 years and are familiar with everything's little quirks. Talk to your HVAC technicians and your engineers and get a sense from them of what is needed to take care of everything in your facility. And be aware of everything in your facility. There's a lot of people who lose sight of what all is involved in a building and how many moving parts there actually are. Get as much information as you can. Ask as many competent people as you can and get a diverse background on what maintenance is going to be needed in your facility moving forward. And make that a priority. One of the things that I recommend to places is if you're at a place where there's a lot of fires going on, take a minute or take a month, I should say, and hire an extra person, whether on contract or on, if you have a part-time person, you can increase their hours for a couple of weeks or something like that. Invest in having additional people on site for a month. Get all of those fires put out, and then get to start on that first round of preventative maintenance. Get everything fine-tuned all at once. Do a big checkup. Have everything, every bolt should be tightened, every hinge should be greased, and every cog should be oiled. Take the time, do it right the first time, and then make sure that you're committed to it moving forward. And don't deviate from your plan. If the plan calls for, all of the hot water pumps need to be oiled on the second week of the month, make sure that that's happening. Write it down, document it, and hold yourself accountable and hold others accountable. One of the churches that I volunteered with, they did not have a maintenance staff. They did not have people. They had a volunteer task force, they called it, that was responsible for maintaining a fairly significant facility. And we did that, where we stopped for a month. We hired a contractor in to act as a maintenance person for a month. And we put out every single fire. And then we put together all of our preventative maintenance schedules. And what we did was we put those preventative maintenance schedules in the front office. And that way, from that day on, everyone knew what had been missed and what hadn't been missed. And our goal wasn't to blame people, because this was a group of volunteers who were taking care of the facility. There was no one to blame. But instead, it was an opportunity for other people to be able to see and go, no one's done the oiling of the hot water pump this month. That should be done. I see it on the sheet, but I see that it hasn't been done. So either if that person happens to be trained to do that job, they can do it themselves, or it's a reminder to them to go and say, hey, Donovan, did you know that no one's done that this month? And you might go, I know, I wasn't aware, but I can go do that because that's something that I'm part of that task force, so I can help with that. And it makes everyone communally responsible. But what it also does, and this is really critical, is it reminds everyone what all is involved. Whether you're using a staff person or a volunteer team, a lot of people aren't aware of what it takes to take care of a building. And you can get back into that situation where you burn out volunteers. If they aren't being appreciated properly, if they aren't being recognized for the hard work that they do, a lot of people have no idea what goes in to taking care of a building. And those people end up getting ignored because people don't understand. I was very grateful the one year, one of the churches that I work with quite a bit still to this day, their honorary, unpaid volunteer property manager wrote out his report for the annual meeting. And he wrote down everything that he did for a whole year. And everybody in the room stood up and applauded it. Because it's the first time that it occurred to people what was actually involved in taking care of that building. So making the community responsible to understand that this is important, this is an ongoing responsibility, and this is part of our commitment as a church, as an organization of faith. This is part of our responsibility to make sure that we're tending this resource so that the next generation can enjoy it as well.
That's a great point, Frank, and that kind of takes us right to the quote there on the screen. A great quote by Patrick Scriven on an article that he wrote on deferred maintenance, and you can read it there, but it says the problem with deferred maintenance is that it is borrowing upon the promise of the future for the sake of the present. A broken physical plant is a terrible thing to gift upon the next generation. And what I take from reading that is when you're deferring this maintenance and you're not doing anything about it, you're borrowing from your facilities, and eventually you're inevitably going to have to pay that back in some form or fashion. And I know there's a lot of different studies out there that talk about what the cost is of deferred maintenance, but it tends to be around, kind of the average seems to be around 2x each year that it's deferred. So if we have a $500 fix now, in a year from now that's going to be $1,000, and it just keeps going up from there. So if you look at it from that perspective, and the interest, if you will, that you're paying on that deferred maintenance, you would never take a bank loan out on interest that high. So why would you defer maintenance when it's costing you that much? But again, it goes back to the mindset and understanding the importance of it.
And it goes back to that idea of good, strong, objective reserve fund planning. The reality is, if you want to take care of what you currently have, you're going to start to need to push things ahead faster than you expect, and then your plan is going to start falling on its face. And once that starts, you're going to go into catch-up mode. And like I said before, catch-up mode is the hardest place that you will ever be in when it comes to managing, an institution, a long-term facility. And if you aren't staying on top of all of it regularly and properly and prominently, you're going to start backpedaling. And once you've backpedaled enough, you're going to have the problem where you're going to be in the catch-up place. A lot of our equipment, a lot of our features and our architectural features of our facilities need to be properly maintained to get the full life expectancy out of them. A brick wall can stand for 1,000 years, but you're going to need to get the tuck pointing done a little bit more often than that if you want it to stay up for that long. A boiler will run for 20 years, but only if you're making sure all the moving parts are greased and oiled regularly. A roof will last, but only if you're taking care of the flashing and making sure that no water is slipping under it in the 30-year lifespan. So it's that ongoing initiative and that requirement, and it has to be a mindset. It has to be a communal decision that this is going to be important to us, that we want people to enjoy this facility the way we've enjoyed it, and we want them to enjoy it for a long time.
That's a great point, Frank. I'm going to talk a little bit about, from there, kind of what we've seen over the last 20 years or so that we've been in business. Because again, this is a mindset, and there's a methodology that we've seen among a lot of our really successful clients in this area that a lot of them all seem to kind of have in common, and that is everyone is bought into that. Like you said a minute ago, it's a communal thing, right? You can't just have the facility manager that understands the value of it, but the leadership team's not on board. Or maybe the trustee chairman sees the value of it, but no one else does. It has to be a full, like you said, Frank, a communal thing. And part of that is, sometimes you have to have the data to tell your story. I've got on the screen here, it's called APPM, and it's that methodology that I was talking about. And basically everything on the right side of the line here, that's the leadership team. And then everything on the left side is the operations team, so the folks who are actually going out and doing the work. And if you start up at the top there at the assessment phase, that's simply getting a baseline understanding of, okay, what assets do we have and what is their life expectancy? What are any potential safety issues we have? What's the replacement cost going to be? And like you mentioned in the beginning, sometimes facility condition assessment is needed to really get accurate information. But once we have that, we move over to the prioritized stage, and that's saying, okay, based on the money that we have and the impact that these different areas are going to make, for example, a $100,000 roof fix can turn into $100,000 or a $200,000 roof fix, whereas something cosmetic over here, while that might be good for first impressions, it's not going to have a financial impact. So obviously we want to put the safety issues first, then the code and compliance, and then the things that are going to extend the life of the facilities. But once we've established what those things are, then move over to the planning phase and saying, okay, here's the time that we have, here's the resources that we have, and that may involve ramping it up for a month or two like you were talking about. And here's the money that's going to be needed to do the work and then to keep up with the preventive maintenance moving forward. And then from there, we're moving over to the execution stage, and we're actually doing this work. We've got the boots on the ground. We're going out and getting up to speed on the preventive maintenance, putting out those fires, any deferred maintenance. And then if we're doing those first 4 stages well, then we move over to the maintain stage, and there's always going to be fires to put out, but once we get to that stage, it's a much more controlled environment, and we're able to focus more on the preventive maintenance.
And I think a part that I would just add in there, Donovan, if I can just weasel in there for a minute, is when you're talking about preventative maintenance, your preventative maintenance plan and your replacement reserve plan has to go hand in hand. And sometimes you're at the stage of your preventative maintenance plan where replacing something is the logical thing to do. Don't try to maintain an asset until the day it breaks. That is usually spells more disaster than you think. When you're at that 20-year mark where you've planned, you've set aside, you're going to replace that boiler, it seems to be working okay. Get it replaced anyway. It's time. You've planned for it. It's the logical thing to do. Move on with it so that you aren't going to start interrupting the plan, because what happens every time you make that decision that you're not going to replace it in the summer of 2020 like you planned to do, and then come winter of 2021, you're having a lot of problems because the boiler keeps breaking down and you're waiting 2 weeks to get parts in. So stick to the plan and just keep going. On that diagram you have on the screen right now is very helpful. It's a very factual statement of what needs to be happening. The constant reality of our work, of our stewardship of our buildings, is that we will constantly be reviewing, we will constantly be planning out, and then we will constantly be making repairs and effecting replacements, and then continuing to maintain our facilities. And stick to the plan, and it won't let you down.
That's a good point. And typically that boiler is going to break down on Christmas Eve during the Christmas Eve service, right? So
No, 15 minutes before so that everyone can freak out for 15 minutes. So
good point. Good point. And Frank, that's you hit the nail on the head, because you'll see the arrows don't stop after the maintain stage, right? The arrow goes back to the assessment stage because we don't want to get into that run to failure mode. There should be, and this is where the breakdown almost always occurs, is we're going through this cycle to a degree, but then we're not doing a great job at tracking what we're actually doing. So Frank, you talked about tying the preventive maintenance into your capital plan. I would take that a step further and say that everything should be tied into your capital plan, because when you can now see, okay, these are the assets that we have, this is how much we've spent on them over the last year, 3 years, or their total life, and this is the kind of work we've been doing. When we can start to see those trends, we can start to pull out those bad eggs, like you were saying, Frank, not instead of waiting until they just stop working, you can start to see when they're reaching the end of their life. Would you agree to that?
Absolutely. And being on top of it vigilance is going to be your constant companion if you're doing this well and staying ahead of things. And what I've found over the years is when you get into this mindset, when you get into this place, it makes everything run smoother. It becomes a communal part of the identity of a place that we're going to take responsibility for moving things forward. And we have to capture everything in what we're doing so that we stay ahead of it. Because it doesn't matter whether it's a big piece of equipment like your boiler or a makeup air unit or an air handler, or whether it's something small like a projector in the main sanctuary. Things break down and then they become a problem. Get to it before it becomes a problem.
Great point. Great point. Frank, any last minute questions here before we, last minute thoughts before we get to some questions?
I would just encourage people to think long and hard about whether or not you're prepared to make the commitment to your building that is necessary. And if you aren't, start thinking about what you want to do instead, because it is a big commitment. You need to be prepared to set aside and save what is right and not just what's left. You need to be prepared to swallow those big pills and make those big expensive purchases because it's time and because it's part of the plan and because it's part of that ongoing work that needs to be done. And you need to commit to it every single day, and you need to hold yourself accountable, and your colleagues need to hold you accountable. And as a community, it has to be part of who you are as stewards of that facility. Most of us are very fortunate that we have worship facilities that have been with us for generations, and we've expanded on them, and we've changed them, and they've evolved to be part of our identity as a person. And we look back on those places, and we love those places. And I think we all kind of want someone else to have that same experience that we had. But that means you have to stay committed to it every day without interruption.
Great point. I could not agree more.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much. Thank you, Donovan. Thank you, Frank. We already have a couple questions, but before we get to those, at this point, I've just popped up a question here on the screen. If you'd like to know how Donovan, if you'd like to have a conversation with him about how our CMMS or how he can help you with capital planning can help your church or nonprofit, please let us know here. If you'd like any additional resources, Donovan writes some great articles for Church Executive magazine and has some great speaking engagements. So there's definitely more where this great information comes from. But while you're still submitting your questions and answering any polls here, Frank, I'd like to start with the first question here. When already in a position of playing catch-up, how would you recommend planning for the catch-up costs while also recognizing and preparing for the current needs?
That is the biggest challenge that every church, not-for-profit, and charity is going to face at some point. And I think the first step is, again, going back to that idea of taking a communal responsibility. Make it known. And as it can seem very embarrassing. It can seem almost, it's sad. If you're the head of that leadership team, you're the chair of the trustees, whatever, You need to go out there and you need to say, this is our problem and this is how much it's worth. And make those steps towards fundraising those monies and or financing those monies if it's absolutely necessary. But own the problem. Do not bury the problem. I have gone to so many churches over the years where the leadership team takes me into a back room and says, so we have a problem and we've known about it for 5 years, but it got really bad last week and now we don't know what to do about it. And we've buried it really well so nobody else knows about it. That's not something to be proud of. You need to talk about it. You need to open up about it, and you need to look at what all opportunities are available and take advantage of every opportunity, whether it's financing, whether it's fundraising, whether it's looking for grants and other functions that are available. Talk about the problem. Because the reality is, you can be the best leadership team in the world. There's always someone who has a better idea than you do, and there's always somebody who has a worse idea than you do. Talk about it openly and get the best information and get the best resources available to help solve your problem.
Perfect. Another question we have here is that if someone doesn't have a capital budget in place for their facility, where would you suggest they start writing that, or where do you suggest is kind of a square one for them to begin that process?
So square one is agree amongst your leadership team, amongst your congregation, amongst everybody, as wide a circle of people as possible. Agree that your building is important and it's something that you want to keep. If you're not going to be committed to that ideal, you're going to have problems from square one. Square two, dig through every single hole, get up into the attic, go down into the basement, go dig up the lawn if you have to. Do whatever you have to do to get a complete list of every single component in your building. Every pew, every chair, every light bulb, every piece of equipment, every roof, side, everything needs to be documented. And then begin the process of applying realistic replacement values and realistic lifespans on everything. And then in tandem with that, take that same inventory and decide what pieces can be worked on a preventative basis and what pieces are going to require shorter term response. And then start setting that money aside now so that when the purchases come, you're ready to face them.
Perfect. Well, with that, I have put my contact information up here on the screen. If you had any questions that you didn't want to ask today, please feel free to send those over. I will get them to Donovan and Frank as they are the experts. But other than that, we'll have a few more questions left for everyone. Oh, wait, we have one more question that just came in. Frank, how useful are building condition assessments as they pertain to capital budgets and planning? They are an expensive endeavor and not always feasible. Are there any alternatives that you can recommend?
Building condition assessments have always and will always have a sticking point for every building manager ever, and that is a fact of life. The grain of salt that you'll need to take with any building condition assessment is how much time the engineer or the author of the report took into getting factual, realistic quotes about what replacement costs of things are going to be. And I strongly advise people, get a building condition assessment done because it puts an independent third set of eyes on your building. And that's the important part. Is it someone who hasn't been walking that hallway every week for the last 15 years? Who is going to notice that there's a valve there that no one's really paid attention to for a long time. So get that building condition assessment done, but take the time to check the pricing and make sure that it's valuable and make sure it's realistic and make sure it's helpful. And if you have concerns, talk to the author of the report. Ask them how they came to that price point. And if you don't entirely agree with how they came to that price point, go and get quotes for yourself. Investigate it yourself. The most valuable piece of a building condition assessment is, in my opinion, is going to be lifespan. When you have an independent third party come in, they're normally pretty qualified individuals who are going to be very helpful at giving you a realistic expectation on whether this item is going to last a week, a year, a decade, or more, or if you probably should have replaced it last week. To take the time, I think it's a valuable resource. I do believe in building condition assessments, but do take the time to verify the accuracy, especially when it comes to dollar amounts, and work from there on inflation and on knowledge of what's going on in your area and how costs are changing and what technologies might be available to help extend the life of your equipment, or what technologies you might want to invest in to replace your equipment.
Perfect. We actually have another question that came in. Someone would like to know, how do you change the mindset of the, quote, old guard with respect to trying to recognize the need to start managing warship facilities more as businesses? Capital budgets and planning, establishing new goals and objectives is almost always a difficult task when it comes to the old guard.
Oh, the old guard. Yes, the old guard. We love the old guard. We want to love the old guard, and we must love the old guard. As I said before, the hard part is going to be the communal buy-in. And the reality is that you're going to have a hard time getting through to the old guard. You're going to have a hard time. That is an end statement. That is a fact. I can guarantee you on that one. You're going to have a hard time convincing the old guard. So what you need to do is you need to take the time to explain to them the value of what you're promoting, what you're trying to get going to. I find that the most effective thing is to ask those people. Ask them point blank, do you want this building to be here when your granddaughter decides she's going to get married? Do you want this facility to be here when, your granddaughter is getting baptized? Do you want this facility to be here? And the automatic answer is, yeah, of course. And then the automatic answer that follows that is always the same, but it's been fine for 50 years, so why would anything change? And I think it's important to walk people through things and walk people through what is changing. It can be very time-consuming, but again, if as a community you are dedicated to this idea of investing in your facility, you'd be shocked what you can get across to people. So take those people under wing. Show them that makeup air unit that clangs every 25 minutes and where, you can start seeing those scuff marks on the side from the blade that's gone off kilter. Start showing them those things and help them understand. People are much better able to understand what they can see than what they are just told. When you're putting together, another reason I love building condition assessments is the engineers and authors love to take lots of pictures. They love to justify what they're telling you in pictures because they know that that's realistic. If they put in a document, this thing is cracked, if they don't take a picture of it, you're never going to find it. If it's in the basement or in the crawl space underneath the sanctuary, to show people what's going on. Set up a slideshow at your next meeting where you're going to discuss this. Show people what the problem is and show them what the next stage is. Explain to them what the value is of moving past where we are. Whether it's new equipment that's more efficient, whether it's new finishes that have longer life expectancies or are more appealing, whatever it is, show them what is going to be available if we plan as a community to move into the next chapter together.
Perfect. And it looks like we're right at the 2 o'clock moment, but we have one last question. Someone says, accessibility is a key issue at the moment. With new and revised accessibility legislation, with an already tight budget, how can they afford to make these very important accessibility upgrades? Are there any grants or funding programs for these types of improvements that you're aware of? And Frank, just to let you know, these people are up in your neighborhood in Ontario, Canada.
Oh, hello, Ontario people. It's lovely to hear from you. Yeah, the reality is that different states, different provinces are all going to have different programming going on. This, again, is another value add. When you have a building condition assessment done, talk to your engineer, talk to a local engineer, talk to a local consultant. They will have a wealth of information of what programs are available. In Ontario, we have huge amounts of grant monies available for different realities and different accessibility projects, and different organizations have their own internal mechanisms. I'm sure that there's people here who aren't from Ontario, so I won't spend too much time explaining dozens of Ontario programs, but they are out there, so take advantage of those people who are local. And you're right, it can be really hard to deal with the accessibility matters that are coming up now. And it's a hard pill to swallow in most cases. But what I've found is there's always people out there who are willing to support those things, and there's always organizations available out there. The biggest ones that I see a lot of churches are going to are organizations like Rotary Club, which is international, or the Lions Club, which again is international. These are organizations that committed a lot of their history to investing in accessible communities. So be a part of that. Also, when you're talking about accessibility, don't forget to include your community, your wider community, in that conversation. You'd be surprised. There's a lot of people who don't come to your church on Sunday who have thought about coming to a concert on a Saturday night, or who have thought about renting your hall but decided not to. So make those people part of the conversation and make your community stakeholders part of that conversation. And it's not just about, trying to get them to join the church, but making them part of the conversation because you want to be part of a wider community. And at the same time, that wider community has different needs than you might need. But talk to your local experts, engineers, contractors. You would be shocked what kind of funding is out there.
Perfect. Well, we are at the 2 o'clock mark now, so I just want to thank you both again for joining us, and thank you for sharing all of your information with us, Frank. Thank you to everyone who has joined us today, and we hope that you'll join us again in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure, Donovan. McKinley, have a great afternoon, everyone.
You too, Frank. Bye, everyone.
Take care.